I had a lot of doubts because of how much, she even told her, oh my gosh, your dad, he was great, he's my idol, and blah, blah, blah. And I just felt like, wow,
It started with a voice, not on a record, not on a stage, inside a quiet church in Arkansas. A voice that made grown men weep and fans whisper, "That's him, it has to be." For years, Priscilla Presley stayed silent. She watched from the sidelines as videos of Pastor Bob Joyce spread across the internet, clips of him preaching, singing, moving people to tears. The voice was deep, warm, hauntingly familiar. Too familiar. To many fans, it was impossible. To others, it was proof. Elvis Presley was alive, and he had been hiding in plain sight, living a second life behind the pulpit. At first, Priscilla ignored it. She'd learned long ago that the world would never stop seeing Elvis as a mystery to solve rather than a man who once lived, loved, and suffered. She thought the theories would fade like all the others, but they didn't. The story of Pastor Bob Joyce only grew. Every new video, every interview, every song he sang brought another wave of believers. And through it all, Priscilla said nothing. Her silence only made it worse. Comment sections filled with wild speculation. She knows something. Look at her eyes when they mention him. Why won't she deny it? Each post, each video, each rumor built the same question higher and higher until it wasn't just curiosity anymore. It was obsession. But then after years of holding her tongue, Priscilla finally spoke. She didn't do it at a press conference or through a lawyer's statement. It was quiet, almost too quiet. A few words during an interview that caught everyone off guard. The journalist asked about the viral preacher, expecting her to laugh it off. But Priscilla didn't laugh. Her tone was steady, her eyes unreadable. "I've seen the videos," she said softly. "I've heard the voice." The room froze. She paused, almost as if choosing her next words carefully. "It's remarkable," she continued. "But people hear what their hearts miss most." That single sentence was enough to send the internet into a storm. Fans replayed it over and over, dissecting every syllable. Was she dismissing the theory or confirming it in her own guarded way? Her expression didn't give anything away. She wasn't angry, she wasn't emotional, just calm and impossibly sad. Because deep down she knew what that voice represented. For Priscilla, hearing someone sing like Elvis wasn't entertainment. It was a wound reopening. It wasn't a fantasy to her. It was a reminder of the man she once loved, the father of her child, the man she watched rise higher than anyone and fall harder than the world would ever understand. When Pastor Bob Joyce opened his mouth to sing, it wasn't Elvis she heard. It was grief finding a melody again. Still, fans refused to let it go. They compared old Elvis recordings to Bob Joyce sermons frame by frame, running audio through software, analyzing the breathing, the tone, the inflection, and the results only deepened the mystery. Some clips matched eerily close, some didn't. But what mattered more than proof was hope. Hope that somehow Elvis had found a way to keep living in another form, away from fame, away from pain. And that hope, dangerous and beautiful, was something Priscilla understood too well. Because for decades she carried her own quiet belief, not that Elvis was still alive in body, but that he never really left. His energy was everywhere, his laughter, his music, the way strangers still cried when they spoke his name. She'd walk through Graceland sometimes and swear she could still feel him there, like the walls were humming with memory. So when people said that voice is Elvis, Priscilla didn't argue. She knew better than anyone that legends don't die, they echo. But this time, her calm words broke the internet because they came from her. The one person who had every reason to deny it. The one person who could have ended the rumor with a single sentence. Instead, she gave the world something far more haunting. Ambiguity. Reporters tried to twist her meaning, to pin her down, but Priscilla refused to elaborate. She'd said what she wanted to say. Nothing more. And in that silence, fans found both heartbreak and validation. Because maybe, just maybe, she wasn't denying it. Maybe she was acknowledging something deeper, that the soul of Elvis Presley had found a new vessel, a new purpose, a new way to speak to people who still needed him. Or maybe she was simply saying that grief plays tricks on the human heart, that when you miss someone enough, every note that sounds like them becomes a prayer. Either way, one thing was certain. Priscilla Presley had finally spoken, and instead of ending the mystery, she had just given it new life. Her silence had lasted decades, but her words, those calm, careful words, would echo much longer. To understand Pastor Bob Joyce, you have to start with the sound, that unmistakable baritone, smooth, soulful, and echoing with the same rhythm the world once heard from the King himself. When he sang gospel hymns like Amazing Grace or Peace in the Valley, people didn't just hear music, they heard memory, they heard Elvis. At first, it was just a curiosity, a few locals in Benton, Arkansas sharing church recordings online, but then the video spread, reaching millions. And suddenly, the small church pastor with the familiar voice became the center of one of the internet's strangest and most emotional debates. Some said it was impossible, a coincidence, a trick of genetics or tone. Others were convinced beyond doubt. That's Elvis Presley. He's alive, preaching under a new name. The theory wasn't just rumor, it was religion for some. Entire channels emerged comparing vocal waves, jawlines, and gestures. Some even claimed to find hidden messages in his sermons. But behind the noise, Pastor Bob Joyce kept doing what he always did, preaching, singing, and refusing to entertain the circus around him. When asked about Elvis, he didn't deny or confirm. He simply said, "I'm Bob Joyce. I sing for the Lord." And that was the kind of answer that only made the world listen harder. To Priscilla Presley, watching from afar, the situation was almost unbearable. She had spent half her life trying to protect the truth of who Elvis was, not just the legend, but the human being. The man who cried when he prayed. The man who struggled to carry the weight of his fame and faith. The man whose voice had carried both power and pain. Now that same voice was living again through someone else, not as imitation, as presence. It wasn't lost on Priscilla that Pastor Bob often spoke about redemption, how God gives people second chances, how the Spirit can find new life through service. Words like those cut deep for someone who had watched Elvis wrestle with his own salvation. There were nights when Elvis would walk through Graceland's halls, Bible in hand, searching for peace. He'd quote scripture between shows, asking if God could forgive him for living two lives, the star and the man behind it. And now here was another man, decades later, preaching that very message in a voice that made millions believe it was him. Priscilla understood why people wanted to believe. Hope is a powerful thing. It fills the empty places that loss leaves behind. It gives meaning to grief. For fans who never met Elvis but felt like they knew him, Pastor Bob was more than a look-alike or sound-alike. He was a living echo of everything they missed. Still, there was something eerie about it. The way the lines between faith and fantasy blurred. The way believers spoke of Brother Bob and the King as if they were one and the same. To Priscilla, it wasn't just a rumor. It was the resurrection of a ghost she'd never fully buried. And yet, despite all the confusion, she couldn't bring herself to condemn it. Because behind the conspiracy was something strangely beautiful, a man dedicating his voice to worship, not fame. If Elvis had been alive to see it, she sometimes thought, maybe he would have smiled. Maybe he would have envied that kind of peace. But Priscilla also knew that every sermon Bob Joyce delivered, every note that reminded the world of that unmistakable voice, pulled her back into a story she'd spent decades trying to end. The world wanted to believe in miracles. She wanted to believe in closure. For her, it wasn't about proving whether Pastor Bob Joyce was Elvis or not. It was about something deeper, whether love and faith could survive the noise of myth. Whether people could finally see Elvis not as a man hiding behind a new name, but as someone whose spirit had already found its rest. Still, the irony lingered. The same faith that had comforted Elvis in his darkest moments was now the very thing keeping his legend alive. And as the theories grew louder, Priscilla realized she couldn't ignore it forever. Because when the voice of the man you loved starts singing again, even from another mouth, silence becomes impossible. But what she said next would change everything the fans thought they knew about her. And about him. When Priscilla finally spoke again, it wasn't to silence the rumors, it was to tell the truth only she could carry. Her words didn't sound like a confession. They sounded like something between love and surrender. She began slowly, her voice steady but tired. "People have asked me for years what I think about Pastor Bob Joyce," she said. "I think he's a man who loves God. And that matters more than anything else." But then she paused, long enough to make every listener hold their breath. "Do I hear Elvis in him?" she continued. "Sometimes, I do." Those 5 words hit harder than any headline ever could. The interviewer leaned in, waiting for her to clarify, but Priscilla didn't rush. She let the silence breathe, the kind that carries both ache and acceptance. When she spoke again, her tone softened. "When you've loved someone that deeply, their voice never really leaves you. It lives in your memory, in your bones. Sometimes, when the world is quiet enough, you hear them again." It wasn't proof, it wasn't denial. It was something far more human. The truth about grief, dressed as mystery. People wanted her to explain, to confirm or reject the fantasy once and for all. But how could she? For Priscilla, Elvis was never just a man who died. He was a presence that refused to fade. The way he laughed, the way he prayed, the way he'd sing to her in the early mornings when the house was still, those moments didn't die. They replayed in her mind like echoes trapped in time. And maybe that's why Pastor Bob's voice shook her so deeply. Because it wasn't just sound, it was memory disguised as music. Priscilla admitted something she had never said before. That once, out of sheer curiosity, she listened to one of Bob's sermons alone. She didn't expect much, but when he began to sing, her chest tightened. For a moment, she said, she forgot where she was. The words, the warmth, the phrasing, it was like hearing Elvis pray again. She said she cried, not because she believed it was him, but because for a few minutes it felt like she could reach across time and touch something she thought was gone forever. When fans heard this, they didn't know how to feel. Half of them saw it as proof that she was finally acknowledging the impossible. The other half felt the weight of her honesty, the quiet heartbreak of a woman who had never stopped missing him. But Priscilla wasn't trying to feed the legend. She was trying to remind people that loss isn't logical. It doesn't fade cleanly. It echoes. She went on to say, "When people hear Pastor Bob and say they hear Elvis, I understand. They're not crazy. They're remembering. And sometimes remembering is the only way we keep love alive." That sentence alone became a quote that traveled faster than any rumor. It wasn't about resurrection. It was about reverence. Behind her calm tone was something deeper, the kind of truth that only someone who's lived through the storm could say. She'd seen what fame could do, how it could consume everything pure and twist it into myth. She wasn't there to prove or disprove the theories anymore. She was there to protect what was left of his soul. Priscilla had spent decades correcting stories, fighting false claims, trying to preserve the real man behind the crown. But this time, she let it go. "Maybe," she said, "Elvis doesn't need defending anymore. Maybe his spirit has already found peace where none of us were looking." The interviewer was stunned. Fans were speechless. For once, she wasn't the gatekeeper of Elvis's past. She was a woman allowing herself to feel again. Because in her heart, this wasn't about Pastor Bob Joyce at all. It was about the quiet truth no one wanted to face. That love this big doesn't end. It just changes form. By the end of her words, no one cared whether she believed he was Elvis or not. What mattered was the tremor in her voice when she said, almost to herself, "Maybe it doesn't matter who sings it, as long as the song still means something." In that moment, the mystery became something sacred. Priscilla hadn't just spoken about Pastor Bob Joyce. She'd spoken about every person who's ever tried to keep love alive after loss. And though her words ended there, the feeling didn't. Because somewhere between faith and memory, between truth and longing, her voice trembled with the one thing no theory could ever explain: what it really means to miss someone who never truly left. In the weeks after her quiet confession, something changed. Not in the headlines, not in the gossip, but in the way people listened. Suddenly, the story wasn't about whether Pastor Bob Joyce was Elvis. It was about what Elvis had left behind, and how that legacy still spoke through people who never met him. Across small towns and city streets, fans began describing something strange. They said when Pastor Bob sang, they didn't just hear a voice, they felt something. A peace. A kind of warmth that had nothing to do with fame. Some said it reminded them of their parents listening to Elvis on Sunday mornings. Others said it made them believe again, after years of losing faith in everything. Maybe that's what Priscilla meant when she said, "Love doesn't fade, it just changes form." Because what started as a rumor had become something far deeper, a shared heartbeat between memory and hope. Pastor Bob never claimed to be Elvis. He never capitalized on the resemblance, never tried to sell the illusion. He just kept singing. Week after week, his sermons turned into confessions of faith, forgiveness, and redemption, the very things Elvis had spent his life searching for. And in that, there was irony. Because the man the world lost to fame might have finally found his peace through someone who never asked for attention. Priscilla understood that more than anyone. For years, she carried the burden of keeping Elvis's truth intact, the way he loved, the way he broke, the way he prayed. But this time, she didn't step in to correct anyone. She didn't need to. The story had outgrown proof. In her heart, she began to see it differently. Maybe Pastor Bob wasn't meant to replace Elvis at all. Maybe he was meant to remind people of what Elvis stood for when the lights dimmed and the stage went dark. Faith, kindness, and the fragile hope that tomorrow could still be better than today. She once said, quietly to a friend, "If people hear him and feel closer to God, that's something beautiful." Elvis would have wanted that. That's the part no one talks about. The spiritual side of Elvis, the one who read scripture before every show, who believed his voice was a gift meant to heal, not just entertain. The same voice that now seemed to echo through another man's gospel. So maybe this was never about conspiracy at all. Maybe it was about continuation. The same way music passes through generations, love and faith travel too. They change voices, faces, and names, but the soul behind them stays the same. Priscilla's silence all those years wasn't denial. It was reverence. She was guarding something sacred, the space between truth and legend. And when she finally did speak, she didn't clear the mystery. She made it human again. Because in the end, what she said wasn't about believing Elvis had come back. It was about believing he never really left. Even now, when Pastor Bob sings, "How Great Thou Art," people close their eyes and swear they can hear the King again. But maybe that's the point. Maybe we don't hear the man. We hear what he left behind in all of us. A sound, a spirit, a reminder that grace has a melody. For Priscilla, it was enough. She didn't need to chase explanations anymore. She didn't need to fight the rumors or defend the past. She had made peace with the idea that Elvis's legacy wasn't hers to control. It belonged to the people who still believed, the ones who found hope every time they heard that familiar tone carried by another voice. And maybe that's how legends live forever, not through proof or pictures, but through the echoes they leave behind in others. When she was asked one last time if she truly believed Pastor Bob Joyce could be Elvis, she smiled faintly and said, "I believe some voices are too big for one lifetime." And that was it. No denial, no confirmation. Just faith, spoken like someone who had learned that love, once real, never disappears. It just finds another way to sing. Because maybe that's what Elvis wanted all along. Not to be remembered as a star, but as a soul whose music never stopped reaching people. And through Priscilla's final words, that truth finally found harmony. Some legends die, others turn into prayers. And this one, this voice, became both. If this story stirred something in you, take a moment to listen, not just to the voice, but to what it reminds you of. Love, faith, and redemption never fade, they only find new vessels. Comment what you believe below, because some voices don't end, they just keep echoing.